May 5, 1945. A small reconnaissance unit of the United States Army rolls down a dusty Austrian road. They have been fighting through the last gasps of the Third Reich for weeks. They expect to find Wehrmacht soldiers, maybe a hidden weapons depot, or frightened German civilians. They are not prepared for what they are about to see. In the hills above the Danube River, behind a massive wall of granite blocks, exists a world of horror that most Americans, most people on Earth, cannot yet comprehend. Mauthausen. The name few people in the outside world know. The name that tens of thousands of prisoners have whispered in prayers, begged to escape, and died inside. Today, that changes. To understand what American soldiers encountered on May 5, 1945, you first need to understand what Mauthausen was, and what it was designed to do. Mauthausen was not simply a prison camp. It was a killing machine, constructed with meticulous German efficiency and a deliberate cruelty that went beyond even some of the other camps of the Nazi regime. When Nazi Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, an event the Nazis called the Anschluss, the SS immediately began surveying the country for suitable concentration camp sites. They found what they were looking for near the small town of Mauthausen, about 20 kilometers east of Linz, along the Danube River. The site had a crucial strategic asset, a massive granite quarry. The Nazis, obsessed with monumental architecture and Albert Speer's grandiose building schemes, needed enormous quantities of stone. Slave labor would provide it. The suffering of prisoners would literally build the monuments of the Third Reich. Construction of the camp began in August 1938. The first prisoners arrived that same year, primarily German and Austrian men, political prisoners, criminals under Nazi law, and Jews. By 1939, construction prisoners were being forced to build the very walls that would imprison others. The most infamous feature of Mauthausen was not a gas chamber or an execution yard, though those existed too. It was a staircase. 186 stone steps carved into the side of the quarry, descending nearly 50 meters to the quarry floor. Prisoners were forced to carry granite blocks weighing up to 50 kilograms up those stairs. The blocks were jagged, the steps were slippery, and guards watched from above with clubs and rifles. If a prisoner faltered, stumbled, or dropped his block, he was beaten. If he fell down the stairs. The SS guards had a particularly sadistic game they played at the top of the stairs. They called it parachutists. Guards would force a prisoner to the edge of the cliff above the quarry, and push them. Or they would force one prisoner to push another. The body would fall to the quarry floor far below. The stairs became known among prisoners as the Todestage. The stairway of death. The Nazi concentration camp system had an internal classification system, a hierarchy of horror. Category I camps were the least severe. Category II were intermediate. Category III camps were reserved for prisoners the SS had designated for Vernichtung durch Arbeit, annihilation through labor. Mauthausen was the only Category III camp in the entire Reich. The only one. This designation meant that prisoners sent to Mauthausen were not expected to survive. They were sent there to die, slowly, through exhaustion, starvation, beatings, and deliberate brutality. The goal was not to exploit labor for maximum efficiency. The goal was to kill people while extracting whatever brief usefulness remained in their bodies. Over the course of the camp's operation from 1938 to 1945, approximately 190,000 prisoners from across occupied Europe were registered at Mauthausen and its dozens of subcamps. Of those, historians estimate that at least 90,000, and possibly as many as 120,000, died there. In the early years, the prisoners were primarily political opponents of the Nazi regime, German and Austrian criminals under Nazi law, and men the SS considered asocial, a category that included homosexuals, the homeless, and Romani people. As the war expanded, so did Mauthausen's prisoner population. Spanish Republican refugees who had fled to France after the Spanish Civil War, men Franco's fascism had already driven from their homeland, were sent to Mauthausen in massive numbers. Thousands of Polish intellectuals, officers, and priests. Soviet prisoners of war. Greek Jews. Dutch resistance fighters. Hungarian Jews. Yugoslavian partisans. The camp grew. Subcamps multiplied across Austria. Forced labor was deployed at factories, tunnels, and construction projects across the region. Wherever the Nazi war machine needed men worked to death, Mauthausen supplied them. To truly appreciate what American soldiers found when they arrived on May 5, 1945, you need to understand what the prisoners inside had endured, sometimes for years. Prisoners arrived at Mauthausen by train, sometimes after journeys of days in overcrowded cattle cars with no food, water, or sanitation. When the doors opened, those who had survived the journey stumbled out into chaos, SS guards screaming, dogs barking, clubs swinging. The intake process was designed to humiliate and terrorize. Prisoners were stripped of everything: clothing, jewelry, family photographs, religious items, anything that connected them to their former lives. Their heads were shaved. They were given numbers. They were no longer human beings with names. They were numbers in a ledger. The food rations at Mauthausen were calculated to be insufficient. This was not incompetence or shortage, it was policy. The caloric intake provided to prisoners was scientifically designed to result in slow death by starvation. Prisoners received thin turnip soup, a small piece of bread, sometimes a spoonful of margarine or a piece of rotting meat. A man doing heavy labor in a quarry carrying 50-kilogram granite blocks requires perhaps 3,500 to 4,000 calories per day to maintain body weight. Mauthausen prisoners received perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 calories. The deficit was deliberate. The body consumes itself. Muscles waste away. The immune system collapses. Death follows. Survivors described watching comrades transform from healthy men to skeletons within weeks. They described the particular look of a man who was about to die, the sunken eyes, the inability to hold his head upright, the strange disconnection from the world that came when the body had nothing left to spend. Starvation was just one weapon available to Mauthausen's killers. The camp had a functioning gas chamber, constructed in 1941. It was disguised as a shower room. Prisoners were told they were going to bathe. They were sealed inside, and Zyklon B, the same poison gas used at Auschwitz, was pumped through the vents. Men, women, and children died within minutes. There was a shooting wall in the camp's courtyard, where prisoners deemed too weak to work or too troublesome to keep were executed by a shot to the back of the neck. There was a gallows. There were punishment cells where prisoners were placed in stone boxes so small they could not sit or lie down, left there for days without food or water until they died. There were medical experiments conducted on prisoners, injections of unknown substances, operations without anesthesia, studies of how long a human being could survive in freezing water. There was the practice of Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, a Nazi bureaucratic euphemism for murder. Prisoners designated for Sonderbehandlung simply disappeared from the rolls. They were killed by the most convenient method available. In the language of the concentration camps, a specific term emerged for prisoners who had reached the final stage before death. The word was Muselmann, a German word meaning Muslim, used in the derogatory slang of the camps to describe a man who had given up. The Muselmann was a prisoner who had surrendered to his fate. He moved with a shuffling, bent-over gait, staring at the ground. He no longer responded to voices or commands with the speed that could save him from a beating. He had withdrawn somewhere inside himself, away from the horror, away from the body that was betraying him. He was alive, but only just. Other prisoners feared the Muselmann, feared becoming one, feared that to look at one too long was to see your own future. When American soldiers entered Mauthausen, they found thousands of Muselmänner. Men who were technically alive but seemed to be already elsewhere. And yet, people survived. Some survived through luck. Some through the protection of fellow prisoners who smuggled food or covered for them when they were too weak to work. Some survived through skills that made them useful to the SS as administrators or craftsmen. Some survived through sheer biological stubbornness, bodies that refused to give up even when the mind had. Prisoners formed networks of mutual aid that operated in secret, hidden from the guards. Underground resistance cells coordinated sabotage, protected the most vulnerable, and prepared documentation of atrocities they hoped would one day be used to bring perpetrators to justice. The Spanish Republican prisoners, many of them veterans of brutal warfare and political persecution, were particularly organized. They established clandestine communication networks, protected fellow prisoners, and kept meticulous records. It was a Spanish prisoner named Francisco Boix who smuggled photographs out of Mauthausen, photographs taken by SS guards documenting camp conditions, photos that would eventually be used as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. His story is extraordinary, and we'll return to it. By early 1945, the prisoners of Mauthausen could feel the war shifting. The distant rumble of artillery. The increasingly frantic behavior of the SS guards. The sudden changes in camp routine that suggested something had changed in the world outside the walls. As Soviet forces pushed westward and Allied forces pushed eastward, the SS faced a dilemma: what to do with the enormous concentration camp system that had spread across occupied Europe. The decision, broadly, was to move prisoners westward, away from advancing Soviet forces, who the SS feared would liberate prisoners and expose the full scale of Nazi atrocities. So began one of the most brutal episodes of an already unimaginably brutal war, the death marches. Tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners, many already at the edge of death from years of starvation and abuse, were forced to walk. They walked through the winter snow of Central Europe without adequate clothing, without food, without rest. Those who collapsed were shot. Those who tried to escape were shot. Those who simply could not physically continue were shot. Many of these death marchers ended up at Mauthausen. The camp that was already catastrophically overcrowded received wave after wave of new arrivals throughout early 1945, skeletal figures barely alive after marches of hundreds of kilometers. The conditions inside Mauthausen in early 1945 had become, almost incomprehensibly, even worse than before. The camp had been designed for perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 prisoners. By April 1945, more than 80,000 prisoners were crammed within Mauthausen and its satellite camps. Food rations, already barely enough to sustain life, were reduced further. Disease, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, swept through the barracks. Bodies piled up faster than they could be processed. The SS began running the crematoria around the clock. When the crematoria could not keep up with the dead, bodies were stacked in piles. The smell, survivors would later say, was something that could never be forgotten. Never washed away from the memory. The SS commandant of Mauthausen in the final months of the war was Franz Zierreis, a man who had run the camp with sadistic enthusiasm since 1939 and who bore personal responsibility for the deaths of tens of thousands of people. As Allied forces advanced, Zierreis and other senior SS officers discussed what to do with the prisoners. Documents found after the war and testimony from survivors suggest that plans were made to kill all remaining prisoners before the Allies arrived, to eliminate witnesses to the crimes committed there. There are accounts that Zerais considered sealing prisoners in the tunnels of a nearby underground factory and detonating explosives. Other accounts suggest plans to march prisoners into the mountains and shoot them. Ultimately, the pace of the Allied advance may have prevented these plans from being carried out in full. But the killing continued until nearly the last moment. Prisoners continued to be shot, gassed, and beaten to death in the final days before liberation. In a remarkable and largely forgotten episode, in the final days before American forces arrived, a delegation approached the Mauthausen commandant with a proposal. The Vienna Fire Brigade, civilian firefighters, offered to place Mauthausen under their protection and prevent any final massacre of prisoners. The International Committee of the Red Cross was also attempting to negotiate access to the camp and the transfer of prisoners to neutral custody. These efforts, combined with the chaotic final days of the Nazi regime, with orders coming from Berlin that were no longer being followed, with SS men increasingly focused on their own escape, created a kind of paralysis that may have saved thousands of lives. The morning of May 5, 1945. The war in Europe is in its final hours. Hitler has been dead for 5 days. German forces across the Reich are surrendering in large numbers. The Third Reich is collapsing. The American forces approaching Mauthausen that morning were primarily soldiers of the United States Army's 11th Armored Division, known as the Thunderbolt Division, along with elements of the 3rd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. They had been pushing through Austria, mopping up resistance, accepting surrenders. Several accounts suggest that the soldiers who first reached Mauthausen did not initially know what they were approaching. They had been told there was a camp in the area, but the full scale of what the Nazi concentration camp system was, and what Mauthausen specifically represented, was not yet part of their understanding. The first American soldiers to reach the main Mauthausen camp encountered something extraordinary even before they reached the gate. The SS had largely fled. Some had left the night before. Others had changed into civilian clothing and slipped away into the Austrian countryside. The guards who remained were, in some cases, Austrian police who had been assigned to the camp in its final days and who had not been part of the SS murder apparatus. At the gate of the camp, several of the remaining Austrian guards waved white flags. They surrendered the camp. The Americans entered. Soldier after soldier who entered Mauthausen that day would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe what they found. Many never spoke of it publicly for decades. Many wept when they finally did. The smell reached them first, an overpowering smell of death, of human waste, of burning. Then the visual assault began. Emaciated figures in striped prisoner clothing, some of them barely clothed at all, wrapped in rags, began to appear. Some were too weak to stand. Some were lying on the ground, unable to determine if they were alive or dead. Some staggered toward the Americans with their arms outstretched. One American soldier, Sergeant Albert Kosik, later described seeing a man crawl toward him on his hands and knees, a skeleton covered in skin, eyes enormous in a face that had no flesh left on it, and the man reached up and touched his boot and said something in a language Kosik didn't understand. He would later learn the man was saying, "Thank God. Thank God. Thank God." As more soldiers entered the camp, they moved through the barracks and the open areas with a growing sense of shock that veteran combat soldiers, men who had seen death in many forms, were not prepared for. In the barracks, the sick and dying lay on wooden shelves stacked 3 or 4 high, in some cases unable to move. Men who had been healthy adults months earlier now weighed 30, 35, 40 kilograms. Bones visible through translucent skin. Eyes that tracked movement but showed little comprehension. Outside, bodies. stacked in piles near the crematoria. Left where they had fallen in the open. The crematoria had not been running long enough to process all of them. The gas chamber, with its false shower head still in place. The execution yard. The punishment cells. Soldiers wept. Combat veterans who had fought across France and Germany and into Austria, men who had seen colleagues killed, who had killed enemies themselves, stood in this place and wept. Some soldiers vomited. Some could not move. Some walked in silence with expressions that witnesses described as completely blank, a kind of shutdown of the mind in the face of something too large to process. For the prisoners, the arrival of American soldiers was, and this word barely contains the reality, miraculous. Some prisoners who had been barely conscious, too weak to stand, found reserves they didn't know existed. They rose. They walked toward the soldiers. They embraced strangers. They wept. They shouted. Some fell to their knees. Some collapsed immediately after this final effort, their bodies finally allowing themselves to give out now that safety had arrived. Others, particularly those who had been prisoners for years, who had survived previous false hopes, previous rumors of liberation that had come to nothing, reacted with caution. They watched from a distance. They could not fully believe what they were seeing. Some prisoners would later say they did not celebrate immediately because they had stopped allowing themselves to hope, and it took time to rebuild the capacity for hope. The underground resistance networks that had been operating in secret immediately activated. Leaders emerged. Lists were produced. Records were brought out from hiding places. Photographs. Documents. Evidence. Francisco Boix, the Spanish prisoner who had been secretly preserving photographic evidence, was among those who made himself known to American forces in the early hours of liberation. American commanders, recognizing the magnitude of what had been discovered, quickly moved to document everything and secure the site. Photographers were brought in. Medical personnel arrived. But first, the immediate crisis: thousands of prisoners were in critical condition. The medical emergencies were overwhelming. Many of the prisoners were so severely malnourished and ill that simply providing food too quickly would kill them, a tragic medical reality that confronted military doctors who wanted desperately to help. Patients had to be fed special liquid diets first. Their digestive systems had adapted to starvation and could not process normal food. The process of refeeding a severely malnourished person has to be done carefully, slowly, or the body goes into shock. Some prisoners died in the days following liberation, liberated, but not in time. In the days following liberation, Mauthausen became a massive humanitarian emergency. American military medical units established field hospitals within and around the camp. Prisoners suffering from typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and the effects of prolonged starvation were treated, but the resources available were nowhere near sufficient for the scale of the need. Medical personnel from the American forces, many of them with no prior experience of anything resembling this situation, worked around the clock. Some broke down from the emotional weight of what they witnessed. Military chaplains moved through the barracks, offering what comfort they could to the dying and the saved. Despite heroic medical efforts, many prisoners continued to die in the days and weeks after liberation. Their bodies had been so damaged by years of deprivation that even the best available care could not save them. The exact number who died in the weeks following liberation is not precisely known, but it is estimated at hundreds to perhaps over 1,000. In a practice that General Dwight Eisenhower had ordered across the European theater, American commanders forced local German and Austrian civilians, residents of the town of Mauthausen, citizens who had lived near the camp for years, to visit and witness the reality of what had been happening in their vicinity. Townspeople were escorted through the camp. They were made to look at the bodies, the gas chamber, the quarry, the crematoria. They were made to carry bodies to graves. The reactions were varied. Some wept. Some appeared genuinely shocked. Others showed little visible reaction, which horrified American soldiers. Some claimed they had not known the full extent of what was happening behind those walls. Whether this was true, partly true, or a convenient lie was impossible for American soldiers to determine in the moment. Historians have been debating the question of civilian knowledge ever since. Franz Zierreis, the SS commandant who had run Mauthausen with sadistic authority since 1939, had fled as American forces approached. He had not, however, gone far. On May 23, 1945, more than 2 weeks after liberation, American forces located Zierreis hiding at a hunting lodge in the Austrian Alps. When soldiers approached to arrest him, he attempted to flee and was shot multiple times. Critically injured but still alive, Zierreis was transported to a field hospital at Mauthausen, the camp he had commanded. There, in a final irony that even a writer of fiction might have considered too on the nose, Zierreis made a deathbed confession. In the presence of a former prisoner, an American officer, and a translator, he described in detail the atrocities committed at Mauthausen. He confirmed the gas chamber. He described the methods of killing. He gave figures for the number of deaths. He implicated other SS officers and officials. Franz Zierreis died of his wounds on May 24, 1945, before he could be formally tried for his crimes. His confession was used as evidence in subsequent trials. Francisco Boix, the Spanish Republican prisoner who had secretly preserved hundreds of SS photographs documenting life and death in Mauthausen, worked with American investigators in the days following liberation to catalog and preserve this extraordinary archive. These photographs, taken by the SS themselves to document camp activities, and then secretly copied and preserved by Boix and a small network of Spanish prisoners who hid the negatives throughout the war, became crucial evidence at the Nuremberg trials. Boix himself testified at Nuremberg in 1946, presenting the photographic evidence before the International Military Tribunal. He was the only Spaniard to testify at Nuremberg. His testimony and photographs helped convict SS officials and establish the factual record of what had happened at Mauthausen. Francisco Boix died in Paris in 1951 at the age of 30, his health destroyed by his years of imprisonment. He is remembered today as one of the most important witnesses to the crimes of Mauthausen. Accountability for the crimes committed at Mauthausen came through a series of military tribunals convened by American forces. The Mauthausen trial, formerly the Dachau-Mauthausen trial, was held at Dachau, Germany, in March and April of 1946. 61 former SS officers and guards from Mauthausen were tried simultaneously. The charges included war crimes and crimes against humanity, murder, torture, the systematic abuse and killing of prisoners. The tribunal found all 61 defendants guilty. 58 were sentenced to death. 3 received life sentences. It was one of the largest mass conviction in American military tribunal history. The executions were carried out by hanging at Landsberg prison between May and June 1947. Additional trials followed. Over subsequent years, Austrian and German courts prosecuted additional perpetrators connected to Mauthausen, though many escaped justice entirely, disappearing into post-war Germany, Austria, or South America under assumed identities. After liberation, the meticulous records kept by the Nazi bureaucracy, records the SS had not fully destroyed before fleeing, were analyzed. Combined with testimony from survivors and perpetrators, historians have built a detailed picture of the death toll. Conservative estimates place the number of deaths at Mauthausen and its subcamps at approximately 90,000. Other scholarly estimates place the figure higher, as many as 120,000. The precise number may never be known, because record-keeping in the final chaotic months of the war broke down, and many victims were never registered at all. The largest groups of victims were Soviet prisoners of war, Polish citizens, Jews from across occupied Europe, and Spanish Republican exiles. Victims came from over 40 countries. The site of Mauthausen concentration camp is today a memorial and museum, one of the most significant Holocaust memorial sites in Europe. The main camp's stone walls still stand. The granite quarry is still there, with the 186 steps of the stairway of death still descending to the quarry floor. The gas chamber is preserved. The barracks where prisoners lived and died have been partially reconstructed. Hundreds of thousands of visitors come each year, school children, families, politicians, historians, and survivors or descendants of survivors. Annual ceremonies are held each May 5th, on the anniversary of liberation, to honor those who died and those who survived. Former prisoners, growing fewer each year as the last survivors age, have returned to walk through those gates as free people, to lay flowers at memorials, to speak to young people about what they witnessed. We cannot close this story without acknowledging what the liberation of Mauthausen did to the American soldiers who carried it out. For many of them, May 5, 1945 was the worst day of a war full of terrible days. Not because of danger to themselves, the fighting, for most of them, was largely over by then. But because of what they were forced to understand about human beings, about what people are capable of doing to one another. Many veterans of the liberation of Mauthausen and other concentration camps struggled for the rest of their lives with what they had seen. The images did not fade. The smell, some said, never fully left them. They had nightmares for years, for decades. For a long time, many of them didn't speak about it. There was no framework, in the 1940s and 1950s, for what we now call post-traumatic stress. Men who came home from the war were expected to return to normal life, to put what they had seen behind them, to move on. Many could not. It is only in the last decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st century, as these men entered their 70s, 80s, and 90s, that many began to speak publicly about what they had witnessed. To give testimony. To participate in documentaries and educational programs. To finally allow themselves to be witnesses to history. We owe those soldiers, and the prisoners they found, the duty of bearing witness in their stead. Of carrying forward what they saw into a future that must never forget. On May 5, 1945, American soldiers opened the gates of Mauthausen and found a world that should never have existed. They found tens of thousands of people who had been scheduled for death, who had survived not because the system relented, but because the system ran out of time. They found evidence of a crime so vast, so systematically organized, so deliberately inflicted on human beings by other human beings, that even today, nearly 80 years later, historians and scholars and ordinary people still struggle with the full weight of it. The survivors of Mauthausen faced a long and difficult road after liberation. Many had no homes to return to. Their families had been killed. Their countries had been destroyed or occupied. Some spent years in displaced persons camps before finding a place to rebuild their lives. But they were alive. When the gates opened on that May morning, they were alive. The men and women who survived Mauthausen, and the soldiers who liberated them, carried this story forward. Some became activists. Some became educators. Some wrote memoirs or gave testimony. Some simply went home and tried to live. All of them knew something that those of us born into peaceful times cannot fully know, but must try, with all the empathy and imagination we possess, to understand. They knew what it costs. The full price of indifference to human suffering. The full cost of systems that treat human beings as less than human. And they knew, those who survived, what liberation actually means. Not just freedom from captivity, but the return of something the camps tried to take from them entirely, their status as human beings. Their names. Their histories. Their worth. On May 5, 1945, the gates opened. The world outside came in. And they were, at last, themselves again.